The cruelest irony of avoidant attachment is that the people they love most deeply often become the people they treat most poorly. It's not because they don't care. It's because they care so much that their traumatized nervous system interprets your love as the most dangerous threat they've ever encountered. Their hatred isn't really hatred at all. It's terror disguised as rejection, fear masquerading as indifference, and desperate self-protection wearing the mask of cruelty. Understanding this paradox is heartbreaking because it reveals the depth of their internal suffering while simultaneously showing why they can't access the love they desperately crave. The person who makes them feel safest also makes them feel most vulnerable. The relationship that could heal their wounds also threatens to expose them. The love that could save them also feels like it might destroy them completely. Their trauma has taught them that love and pain are inseparable, that caring deeply guarantees devastating loss, that opening their heart means volunteering for emotional annihilation. So when you love them authentically, consistently, and without agenda, their wounded psyche doesn't recognize safety. It recognizes the setup for the worst pain they have ever experienced. The more genuine your love, the more dangerous you become to their survival system. This isn't about logic or conscious choice. It's about a nervous system that learned to associate love with danger, intimacy with abandonment, and vulnerability with destruction. When they push away the people who love them most, they're not being cruel. They're trying to survive what feels like an existential threat to their psychological safety. The tragedy is that their hatred of love keeps them trapped in the very loneliness their hearts are trying to escape. By rejecting the people who could heal them, they ensure their continued suffering while simultaneously punishing those whose only crime was caring about them enough to see through their defenses. Their trauma turns love into the enemy, making them afraid of the very thing that could set them free from their fear. Reason 1. You make them feel too much and they hate feeling. The avoidant has spent years, sometimes decades, perfecting the art of emotional numbing, building sophisticated psychological barriers that keep them safely disconnected from the full intensity of human feeling. They've learned to live in a carefully controlled emotional climate where nothing gets too hot or too cold, too painful or too joyful, too real or too intense. Then you arrive with your authentic love, and suddenly their entire emotional thermostat goes haywire, flooding their system with feelings they've spent a lifetime learning to avoid. Your love doesn't just make them feel good, it makes them feel everything. The warmth of genuine affection melts their emotional permafrost, releasing years of frozen pain, buried grief, and suppressed longing that they've kept locked away for their own protection. When you care about them deeply, you don't just activate their capacity for love, you activate their capacity for all emotions, including the devastating ones they've been hiding from since childhood. This emotional flooding feels like drowning to someone who's only learned to swim in shallow waters. They experience your love as a tsunami of sensation that threatens to overwhelm their carefully constructed defenses and drag them under waves of vulnerability they're not equipped to handle. The intensity isn't just uncomfortable, it feels like it might literally kill them through the sheer force of feelings they've convinced themselves they can't survive. Their hatred of feeling comes from early experiences where emotions were dangerous, unwelcome, or used against them. Maybe their feelings were dismissed, minimized, or punished. Perhaps they learned that showing vulnerability invited abuse, neglect, or abandonment. Their young psyche concluded that feeling deeply was a luxury they couldn't afford, a risk they couldn't take, a vulnerability that would inevitably lead to harm. When you love them, you're essentially asking them to dismantle the emotional fortress that has kept them psychologically alive. You're inviting them to feel not just the joy of being loved, but all the pain they've been avoiding, every abandonment they've experienced, every rejection they've endured, every moment they felt unworthy of care. Your love becomes a key that unlocks every door they've spent years keeping sealed. The particularly cruel aspect of this dynamic is that your love makes them feel more like themselves than they've ever felt, while simultaneously making them feel more terrified than they've ever been. In your presence, their authentic self emerges, the self they've been hiding and protecting through emotional numbness. But this emergence feels dangerous because their authentic self carries all the wounds their false self was created to conceal. They begin to hate you, not because you're harmful, but because you make them remember what they've lost, what they've missed, what they've been protecting themselves from experiencing. Your love serves as a mirror that shows them the depth of their own emotional starvation, the richness of connection they've been denying themselves, the fullness of life they've been avoiding through their emotional restriction. The intensity of feeling you create in them also threatens their sense of control, which is often the only thing that makes them feel safe in the world. When emotions run high, they lose their ability to predict and manage their internal experience. The feelings you evoke feel chaotic, unpredictable, and potentially destructive to someone whose survival has depended on maintaining emotional equilibrium through strict internal regulation. Your love also makes them feel dependent in ways that terrify their autonomy-focused identity. When they start to need your affection, crave your presence, or depend on your understanding, they experience these natural relationship needs as evidence of dangerous weakness. Their hatred becomes a desperate attempt to restore their emotional independence by pushing away the person who threatens their self-sufficiency. They often hate themselves for feeling so much in your presence, which gets projected onto you as the source of their overwhelming emotions. Instead of recognizing that you're helping them access their full humanity, they blame you for disrupting their emotional numbness. You become the enemy, not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've made them remember they have a heart that's been desperately trying to feel again. The depth of their hatred often correlates directly with the depth of feeling you've awakened in them. The more profoundly you affect them, the more desperately they need to push you away to return to the emotional flatland where they feel safe. Their cruelty toward you becomes proportional to how much life you've breathed back into their buried emotional self. This creates the tragic irony where the people who make them feel most alive also make them feel most afraid of living. They hate you for showing them what they've been missing, while simultaneously being unable to handle the intensity of what you're offering. Your love becomes both the answer to their deepest longing and the trigger for their greatest terror, making you simultaneously their salvation and their perceived destruction. Reason 2, you see through their walls, and they need those walls to survive. The avoidant has constructed their entire identity around being unknowable, mysterious, and emotionally self-sufficient. Then you arrive with your intuitive understanding and empathetic insight, seeing straight through their carefully crafted facade to the wounded, terrified person hiding underneath. Your ability to recognize their pain, understand their patterns, and love them despite their limitations feels like the most dangerous form of exposure they could imagine experiencing. Their walls aren't just psychological preferences or quirky personality traits. They're survival mechanisms built from years of learning that being truly seen leads to being hurt, rejected, or abandoned. These barriers have become so integral to their sense of self that they literally don't know who they would be without them. When you look past their defenses and see their authentic self, you're threatening the very foundation of their psychological safety. The terror of being seen comes from early experiences where visibility meant vulnerability, where being known meant being used against them, where their real self was deemed unacceptable, unlovable, or dangerous to others' comfort. They learn to hide not just their flaws, but their strengths, not just their pain, but their joy, not just their needs, but their very essence. Because authentic self-expression felt like handing weapons to people who would inevitably use them for harm. Your insight into their inner world feels like psychological invasion to someone who's only felt safe when they controlled exactly what others could see of them. When you understand their motivations without explanation, recognize their fears without confession, or see their potential despite their self-sabotage, they experience this understanding as a loss of control that threatens their entire system of self-protection. They hate that you can read their emotions in their micro-expressions, that you notice when they're pulling away before they've consciously decided to withdraw, that you see through their casual dismissals to the hurt feelings underneath. This visibility makes them feel naked and exposed in ways that feel more intimate and threatening than physical nakedness ever could. You're seeing parts of them they've never shown anyone, including themselves. The particularly devastating aspect of being seen by you is that you don't use your insight to hurt them. You use it to love them more deeply. This confuses their trauma-based worldview that taught them visibility equals danger. They can't understand why you would see their flaws, limitations, and wounds, and choose to stay rather than run. Your continued presence, despite seeing their truth, feels too good to be real, which makes it feel dangerous. Your ability to see through their walls also means you can see through their lies, the lies they tell others about not needing anyone, and more devastatingly, the lies they tell themselves about being fine with isolation. When you recognize their loneliness despite their claims of contentment, their pain despite their performance of strength, their need for love despite their insistence on independence, you're dismantling the very stories that keep them psychologically functional. They've become so identified with their protective walls that your ability to see past them feels like you're erasing their identity entirely. They don't know who they are without their defenses, their emotional distance, their carefully controlled presentation of self. Being seen and accepted for their authentic self should feel healing, but instead it feels like death because it threatens the false self that's been keeping them alive. The hatred you trigger isn't really about you. It's about their terror of being truly known and found wanting. Despite your acceptance, they can't believe that anyone who really sees them could genuinely love them. Their self-hatred runs so deep that your love feels like evidence that you must not be seeing clearly, which means eventually you'll discover the truth and leave like everyone else did. Your insight also reveals the depth of their self-abandonment and self-betrayal, showing them how much of their authentic self they've sacrificed for the illusion of safety. Being seen by you forces them to confront how much life they've missed, how much connection they've avoided, how much of themselves they've buried to avoid being hurt. This realization feels unbearable to someone who's built their identity around making the right choices for self-protection. They hate that you make them want to be seen despite their terror of visibility. Your loving gaze awakens their buried longing to be known and accepted, creating an internal war between their need for connection and their need for protection. This conflict feels intolerable to someone who's only felt safe when their emotions weren't contradictory or complex. The most tragic aspect of their hatred is that you represent everything they've always wanted, someone who could see past their defenses and love what they found there. But their trauma has convinced them that this kind of love is impossible, dangerous, or temporary. They hate you for offering what they most desire because accepting it would require dismantling the very walls that have kept them psychologically alive, leaving them feeling defenseless in a world that taught them love always comes with devastating costs. Reason 3, you trigger their deepest fear of abandonment, so they leave first. The most twisted logic of avoidant attachment is that the more someone loves them, the more terrified they become of losing that love, which makes them push away the very person they're afraid of losing. Your genuine affection and consistent care don't feel like security to someone whose trauma has taught them that love is temporary, conditional, and inevitably followed by devastating abandonment. Instead, your love feels like the setup for the worst pain they could imagine experiencing. The deepest fear isn't really about being alone. It's about allowing themselves to need someone deeply and then being left to die from that need when the person inevitably disappears. They've learned that attachment equals eventual agony, that caring deeply guarantees future devastation, that opening their heart means volunteering for emotional annihilation. So when you love them authentically and consistently, their wounded psyche doesn't recognize safety. It recognizes the prelude to their destruction. The cruel mathematics of their trauma tells them that the more they allow themselves to love you, the more it will destroy them when you leave. They calculate that it's better to experience the manageable pain of pushing you away than to risk the catastrophic pain of being abandoned after allowing themselves to truly need you. Their rejection of your love becomes a twisted form of self-preservation that guarantees the very loneliness they're trying to protect themselves from. Their fear of abandonment operates like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They become so terrified of you leaving that they start behaving in ways that make leaving seem reasonable. They withdraw their affection to test if you'll stay, become emotionally unavailable to see if you'll still pursue them, create conflict to determine if you'll fight for the relationship. But these tests are designed to fail because deep down they believe abandonment is inevitable. They've learned to interpret love as a temporary illusion that people use to get close enough to cause maximum damage when they leave. Their trauma tells them that your current affection is just the calm before the storm, that your consistency is just preparation for more devastating inconsistency, that your acceptance is just the setup for more crushing rejection. They can't enjoy your love because they're constantly bracing for its withdrawal. The particularly heartbreaking aspect of this fear is that they often abandon relationships during the happiest, most connected periods, because that's when they feel most vulnerable to loss. When things are going well, when they're starting to trust, when they're beginning to believe in the relationship's permanence, that's precisely when their abandonment terror peaks, because they have the most to lose. They leave during good times to avoid being left during bad ones. Their hatred toward you intensifies because you make them remember every person who's ever left them, every promise that was broken, every time they believed in someone's love, only to have it withdrawn without warning. Your love doesn't just represent future potential loss. It represents every loss they've already endured. Being with you forces them to relive their entire history of abandonment through anticipatory grief. They often create elaborate scenarios in their mind about how and when you'll leave, scripting their own abandonment with cinematic detail. They imagine you finding someone better, getting bored with their limitations, realizing you made a mistake, or simply waking up one day and deciding you don't love them anymore. These mental rehearsals for loss become so vivid that they start to feel more real than your actual presence and commitment. The preemptive strike of leaving first feels like the only way to maintain any dignity or control in what they perceive as an inevitable situation. If they push you away before you can abandon them, they can tell themselves they chose the outcome rather than being victimized by it. This gives them the illusion of power in a scenario where they otherwise feel completely helpless and at your mercy. Their abandonment fear also extends to fearing their own capacity to leave you, which creates additional hatred toward the relationship. They hate themselves for being someone who pushes away love, but they also hate you for making them confront this aspect of their character. They can't trust themselves to stay any more than they can trust you not to leave, creating a double bind where both staying and leaving feel impossible. They've often experienced the cruelest form of abandonment, not the dramatic exit, but the slow withdrawal of someone who stays physically present while becoming emotionally unavailable. This teaches them that people don't always leave by walking away. Sometimes they leave by staying but stopping their love. Your continued presence doesn't guarantee safety in their mind because they've learned that people can abandon you without ever leaving the room. The hatred reaches its peak when they realize that despite all their efforts to remain detached, they've started to need you in ways that feel dangerous to their survival. When they catch themselves hoping you'll stay, missing you when you're gone, or depending on your love for their emotional regulation, they panic because they violated their own rules about emotional independence. They hate you for making them need something they can't control, guarantee, or replace. Their twisted logic concludes that hating you is safer than loving you because hatred creates distance while love creates dependency. If they can successfully make themselves dislike you, they won't be devastated when you leave. Their cruelty becomes a desperate attempt to kill their own feelings before those feelings can be used to kill them through the inevitable pain of loss they're convinced is coming. The tragic truth: how trauma turns love into the enemy. The most devastating reality of avoidant attachment is that their trauma has hijacked their natural human wiring for love and connection, turning their deepest biological need into their greatest psychological threat. What should be their sanctuary becomes their battleground. What should heal them becomes what they believe will destroy them, and what should feel like coming home feels like walking into enemy territory where they're guaranteed to be wounded beyond repair. Their nervous system learned to interpret love as danger during crucial developmental periods, when their young brain was supposed to be learning that intimacy equals safety, that vulnerability leads to care, and that emotional needs deserve to be met with consistency and compassion. Instead, they learned that opening their heart meant opening themselves to pain, that needing someone meant giving them the power to devastate them, and that love was just another word for eventual suffering disguised as temporary comfort. The internal war between their heart's longing for connection and their mind's insistence on self-protection creates a psychological battlefield where every gesture of love becomes a weapon that could be used against them. They simultaneously crave and fear the very thing their soul most desperately needs, creating an exhausting internal conflict that makes genuine intimacy feel impossible to achieve or maintain without constant vigilance against their own feelings. Their trauma creates a distorted lens through which they interpret every loving gesture as evidence of impending harm. Your patience becomes proof that you're building up to devastating impatience. Your understanding becomes evidence that you're gathering information to use against them later. Your consistency becomes suspicious because they've learned that people only maintain good behavior until they have enough investment to make leaving particularly painful. The tragedy deepens when they recognize that their hatred of love is keeping them trapped in the very loneliness their heart is trying to escape. They can see that their patterns are self-destructive, that their fear is creating the abandonment they're trying to avoid, that their rejection of love is guaranteeing the emotional starvation they're desperately trying to heal. But awareness doesn't automatically translate to ability. Knowing they're sabotaging themselves doesn't give them the tools to stop. Their love-hate relationship with intimacy creates internal shame cycles that compound their original wounds. They hate themselves for being unable to accept love, which makes them feel more unworthy of love, which makes accepting love feel even more impossible. They become angry at their own limitations, disgusted by their fears, and frustrated by their inability to override their trauma responses through willpower alone. The most heartbreaking aspect is that their hatred often intensifies in proportion to how much they actually love the person they're pushing away. The deeper their genuine feelings, the more dangerous the relationship feels, the more desperately they need to create distance. Their cruelty toward those who love them most isn't evidence of lack of care. It's evidence of how much they care and how terrified they are of that caring. Their trauma has taught them that love equals loss of control, that intimacy means inevitable vulnerability to unbearable pain, and that emotional needs are weaknesses that will be exploited by anyone who gets close enough to see them. These beliefs aren't conscious choices, but unconscious programming that runs in the background of every interaction, filtering every loving gesture through the expectation of eventual harm. The war between love and fear playing out in their psyche isn't just about romantic relationships. It affects their capacity for friendship, family connection, and even their relationship with themselves. Their trauma has created a universal mistrust of intimacy that makes them lonely even when surrounded by people who care about them. They're fighting a battle against their own capacity for connection, treating their heart's natural desires as enemies to be defeated. Yet within this tragic pattern lies hope, because trauma responses can be healed when they're met with consistent safety, patience, and understanding that doesn't require them to perform wellness or overcome their limitations on anyone else's timeline. Their hatred of love isn't permanent. It's a protective response that can soften when they finally encounter the kind of unconditional acceptance that proves love doesn't always lead to abandonment. The path toward healing requires them to slowly, carefully learn to distinguish between past dangers and present safety, between their trauma's warnings and reality's invitations, between protection that serves them and protection that imprisons them. This process can't be rushed, forced, or demanded. It can only be supported through the kind of patient, consistent love that gradually teaches their nervous system that intimacy can be safe. Their hatred of love is ultimately hatred of their own vulnerability, their own needs, their own humanity. Healing happens when they can finally extend compassion to the wounded parts of themselves that learn to fear the very thing they most desperately need. When they can love their own fear without being controlled by it, they can begin to receive love from others without interpreting it as a threat to their survival. The most profound truth is that their fear of love is actually love itself. Love for their own wounded heart. Love for their own survival. Love for their own protection from further harm. When they can recognize their hatred as misdirected self-love, they can begin the slow work of learning that protecting themselves and accepting love aren't mutually exclusive choices, but complementary aspects of a whole and healthy self.